get underway, let me offer a few more words of introduction, just so you can kind of know who's talking to you this morning. It seems to me it's a little bit relevant to what I have to say as well. And I'm going to tell you about myself by talking about my relations with the Chiasson family, which go back to my arrival in British Columbia 14 years ago, where I was Coastal Circuit Minister based in Prince Rupert, visiting First Nations villages that formerly had been visited by the Thomas Crosby, the mission boat that I'm imagining most of United Church folk are familiar with. And Francis's father was my treasurer up there. So imagine my surprise when I came down here in order to reconnect with my wife, who'd been serving as the minister in Winfield, and took a position with UBCO. And there's Mike Chiasson as a colleague in the Faculty of Management. And now, this morning, Sophia has read the scripture, which I'm going to address in this sermon. Let us take a moment in prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Haida Gwaii was one of the ports of call as I traveled around the north for 3 years, some 10 years ago now. And my wife Heather and I had the opportunity to revisit Haida Gwaii just over a year ago. We were there for 5 months serving as supply ministers. The incumbent minister in the United Church there had retired. The congregation was looking for some guidance, some help in figuring out their next steps as they think about moving forward or, frankly, closing the congregation. So Heather and I agreed to this adventure of living on the Skidegate Reserve, situated on the largest and most northerly island of the Haida Gwaii archipelago. Some of you may know these islands as the Queen Charlottes, but in 2009, the Haida people respectfully returned the name of the wife of King George III to the British, and the government of British Columbia began calling the archipelago what its occupants had always called it, the Islands of the People, Haida Gwaii. There are currently about 5,000 people living on the two main islands. 1,500 of them are Haida, and the rest are now referred to as settlers. Loggers, farmers, fishers, service providers, artists, and back to the landers. If you could walk on the ocean floor to a point a few kilometers west of Haida Gwaii, you would come to the spot where the North American tectonic plate meets the Pacific plate, and the ocean drops from a depth of about 150 meters to a depth of 2 miles. This is one of the reasons that Haida Gwaii is called by some people the edge of the earth. It's not only the westernmost point in Canada, it's also literally sitting on the edge of a cliff that marks the edge of North America. From the time of the early Christian desert monks, some people have had an urge to get away from the busyness and bustle and commitments of regular life and live apart from the world. Haida Gwaii is a place that attracts such people. They seek physical isolation so that they can live detached from the distractions and temptations of our modern world. It seems to me that such people are seeking a Sabbath of place. Just as the Sabbath means a day of the week when we put aside the normal routines of life and leave space for our relationship with God, a Sabbath place allows us to separate from the routine and to experience the sacred. Now, experiencing the sacred was not what the first settlers had in mind when they came to Haida Gwaii. When Europeans arrived there in the late 18th century, they had little interest in the sacredness of these islands for the 30,000 Haida who then populated them. The Europeans saw the islands as a place where the potential to enrich the emerging capitalist economies of Great Britain, Spain, and Russia would be fulfilled. The people already there were seen as an impediment to exploiting the natural resources of the islands. Now, from the perspective of these rapacious settlers, it was rather fortunate that indigenous people of the Americas are highly susceptible to European viral illnesses, particularly smallpox. By 1900, the remnant indigenous population of Haida Gwaii was something less than 1,000 people, a mere 3% of what it had been at the first contact with Europeans. The population of the Haida is slowly beginning to recover, and they have begun to lay claim to the sacredness of their land again, to claim it as a Sabbath space that enriches the experience of all humankind. Beginning in 1973, the Haida engaged in negotiations with the federal government, the BC government, and logging companies working in the area to assert their claim that one of the few old-growth forests that remained unharvested should be protected, treated as sacred. When the negotiations proved futile and logging continued, the Haida decided to blockade access to the forests on Lyle Island and protect the territory. This was not a dispute about who gets to benefit from logging income, nor about who owns the land. It was a dispute about how to treat the land. This dispute was resolved by creating a national park reserve, which covers the southern third of the archipelago. This national park reserve includes the sites of a number of ancient villages that were abandoned during the late 19th century as smallpox decimated the populations. But it also includes areas that have never been populated or inhabited, though these areas are part of the traditional territory of the Haida people, as they have been for millennia. The Haida built their villages on the coast, and they traveled by canoe around the island. But the interior forests were their vegetable and fruit gardens, their meat lockers, and medicine cabinets. This vast territory is not a national park, because the federal government has control of national parks. But neither has this territory been acknowledged as sovereign Haida land by the government of Canada. The question of ownership remains unresolved. Instead, Canada and the Council of the Haida Nation have agreed to co-manage the territory for the benefit of future generations. In other words, Canada and the Haida are acting as stewards of the land. One might say that they have recognized that who cares for the land and how they do so is more important than who owns the land, whatever that means. From the perspective of our Christian tradition, we profess the belief that all the earth is a gift from God, and our human role is to care for it, for the good of the earth, as well as for the good of the people who happen to inhabit it at any particular point in time. The unique agreement reached by the Haida and Canada offers a model for other communities. Instead of fighting over who owns the land, let's fight together to preserve the earth. When Jesus told his disciples, as Sophia read this morning, that it was okay for them to gather grain on the Sabbath rather than starve, he was implicitly telling them, and us, that the laws of God and the laws of humankind are intended for the good of humankind, for the good of God's created order. If those laws lead to harm, then they should be put aside, changed, or ignored. Far too often, our modern debates about land use, logging, resource exploitation, pipelines, and similar commercial activities focus on the so-called laws of economics. Extraction of more resources, it is said, will lead to a higher gross domestic product and more wealth for Canadians generally. But the agreement that created the National Park Reserve of Guayhanas, as it's called, suggests another approach to the question of how we collectively relate to the natural world that sustains us. We can break the laws of economics and treat the earth as sacred. It is our mother, and we rely on it for nourishment. But it is also the mother of generations yet to come. And so our responsibility includes caring for it as the gift it is, entrusted to us by God. Let me finish with another story from Haida Gwaii. One of the moments when Heather and I felt most powerfully the sacredness of the islands was while walking the Golden Spruce Trail. Towering giant hemlock, spruce, and cedars block the sun. They soar hundreds of feet from the forest floor. Between and among these sentinels, their fallen brothers and sisters nurture new life as lichens, moss, ferns, even new trees grow from tree trunks that fell 100 or more years ago. The trail is called the Golden Spruce Trail because it leads to a spot on the Yukon River where, until recently, the remnants of a 300-foot-tall Sitka spruce could be seen. This tree, because of a genetic abnormality, was golden instead of green. The Haida called this tree Kidkayas and trace its origin to a young boy who disrespected nature and thereby caused a terrible storm to descend on his village. Only he and his grandfather survived the storm. As they fled the village, the grandfather warned the boy not to look back. He disobeyed and was immediately turned into the golden spruce on the spot where he stood. And for hundreds of years, that tree and that story were sacred to the Haida people. But in 1997, it was cut down by a 47-year-old logger who said he was motivated by, and I quote, if you can explain this quote, you tell me, rage and hatred towards university-trained professionals and their extremist supporters. Now, I'm not sure how to interpret that, but after reading the book on the Golden Spruce written by John Vaillant, a marvelous read, by the way, my wife Heather suggested that the point that Grant Hadwin, the logger, was making was to say that holding one tree as sacred while clear-cutting all the rest is really a way of letting us off the hook. All of God's creation is sacred. We abuse the concept of sacredness if we say it's concentrated in one place. If we are to be sustained by the earth, we must treat all of it as sacred, which doesn't mean we cut down no trees, but that we do so with respect and with an eye to the well-being of future generations. Jesus' intention in saying that the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath affirms God's intention that we should savor the sacredness of the everyday. Surely it's not God's intention that we be excused from loving God and our neighbor on 6 days of the week if we behave ourselves on the seventh. A Sabbath time is a time to reflect on and nourish our sense of the sacredness of every day for the sake of every day. Similarly, Guayhanas is not a place that is set apart as a sacred landscape so that we can rape and pillage the rest of the earth. And though I can't condone the cutting down of the golden spruce, if the point was to say that to preserve one uniquely beautiful tree somehow excuses the ruthless exploitation of our forests, then I can sympathize with the message. My time on Haida Gwaii with my wife was a sacred time. This is a remote, beautiful, sacred territory. The land and the people of Haida Gwaii have become part of who we are, and they have changed our way of seeing the world around us. We had the gift of an opportunity to step out of the ordinary for 5 months. But each one of us here has the opportunity to step out of the ordinary every Sabbath. Every Sabbath of time, every Sabbath of place. May today and all the Sabbaths you experience touch you with the Spirit of the divine and heighten your awareness of God's gift of life, so that you may live as God's stewards, caring for the sacred place in which you find yourself. Amen.